Throughout history, Iceland has carried a deep tradition of witchcraft. In its harsh, unforgiving landscape, magic wasn't just a curiosity on the margins of society, it was a tool of survival. Even through the rise of Christianity, Iceland held onto its magical roots in ways rarely seen elsewhere in the Western world. Events that should have erased paganism only seemed to strengthen the Icelanders' devotion to their native culture. Today, echoes of this pagan past still linger in Iceland, woven into the ordinary and the extraordinary alike. Because of this, we now have access to medieval spellbooks, the names of sorcerers who were once feared and revered, and even the step-by-step instructions of Icelandic magic. This documentary will take you through the full story of witchcraft in Iceland, from its earliest settlers and their blood sacrifices, to the preserved pages of spellbooks, all the way to the unexpected survival of pagan tradition in modern times. The subject is dark, esoteric, and at times deeply strange, but hidden within it is a powerful lesson about how we understand history itself. Short disclaimer, I hope you enjoy this video essay, whether you're listening on YouTube, Spotify, or elsewhere. The visuals are just here to support the experience, so feel free to just listen and engage with the ideas while you relax, study, or even fall asleep, or enjoy the artworks while you listen. If you like my content, please like and subscribe. It really helps me out for free. Share your ideas for the next essay in the comments. Thank you. Let's continue. In the late 9th century, King Harald Fairhair sought to unite all of Norway under his rule. With the influence of Christian Europe, he aimed to establish a monarchy modelled on Christian kingdoms. Not everyone was eager to live under this new order. So, a group of Norwegians, along with their Celtic slaves, sailed west in search of freedom, both political and spiritual. They found it in Iceland. The society they built there was firmly rooted in their heritage. Instead of a single king, the land was governed by local priest chieftains. Once a year, they gathered at a great assembly called the Althing, where disputes were settled and broader matters decided. Remarkably, the Althing still exists today as Iceland's national parliament. This early government had little centralized power. It could issue rulings, but it couldn't enforce them. Justice was left to families. If someone was found guilty, they might be declared an outlaw, meaning the law no longer protected them, and anyone could harm or even kill them without consequence. Alternatively, the guilty party could pay vergild, a set fine, to the injured family. Every crime carried its own monetary value. The state itself gained nothing from these punishments. The settlers' religion was the old Germanic paganism they brought from Norway. Heathenism here doesn't mean barbarism. It simply refers to faiths outside the now dominant religions. In Iceland, people had remarkable freedom in their worship. Some prayed to Odin, others to Freya, or different Norse gods, while some likely worshipped nothing at all. The Celtic slaves may have carried traces of Christianity. In general, religious tolerance was the norm. Still, paganism remained the dominant belief, and within it lived a powerful current of sorcery. Icelandic magic can broadly be divided into two types, Galdr and Sidr. Galdr was seen as the more honourable form, while Sidr was often considered shameful. Think of it as light and dark magic, but keep in mind, those moral labels likely came later, shaped by outside values. Technically, the difference lay in how they were practiced. Galdr was rooted in conscious willpower. The magician would assume a magical persona, almost like an alter ego. Sidr, on the other hand, required entering a trance-like state. as if possessed by another force entirely, similar to shamanism in other cultures. Both likely stemmed from early Germanic traditions. Runes were central to this magic. More than just letters, they were symbols of esoteric power. Runic magicians, often highly respected men of society, were the most prominent practitioners. This male-dominated aspect of Icelandic magic will appear again later during the witch trials and executions. The practice of runic magic usually followed 3 steps. First, carving the runes into an object. Then, painting them, often with the magician's own blood or with the blood of an animal. The final step of runic magic was the spoken word. A verbal incantation would be whispered or chanted over the runes, charging them with power. But these old-world rituals were soon reshaped, sometimes violently, by the spread of Christianity across Europe. By the year 1000, much of Northern Europe, Norway, Denmark, Ireland, England, had officially embraced Christianity. Iceland, however, resisted. When the faith finally arrived, it was accepted in name, but not in spirit. Public sacrifices were banned, but there were no laws against worshipping the old gods in private. Pagan traditions continued largely untouched. These practices included the ceremonial sacrifice and eating of horseflesh, and the grim exposure of infants, where unwanted newborns were left outdoors to die at the mercy of nature. Conversion in Iceland was a slow, uneven process, stretching across decades. Around 1030, though, things began to change. This was the start of what became known as Iceland's Age of Peace. Civil strife diminished, and people became more open to exploring Christianity. Scholars traveled abroad, returning with new religious ideas. But Iceland's Christianity was never strictly orthodox. Converts did not abandon old pleasures or customs. Polygamy lingered. Sorcery endured, even within the church itself. What followed was a strange, contradictory period of Icelandic magic. Christianity declared witchcraft heretical, yet Christian elements seeped into spells and rituals. Figures from the Judeo-Christian tradition began to appear in Icelandic spellbooks, and Catholic prayers blended with ancient incantations. Unfortunately, this period is something of a dark age in our knowledge of Icelandic magic. Few original works were written down. Instead, much of what survives comes through sagas and folk tales written later. These sagas are not pure fact, but they carry threads of truth. One such figure they describe is Semundr Sigfússon, remembered as one of the most magically learned men of his era. Legends say he studied at the mysterious Black School of Satan, likely somewhere in Germany or France. Despite the ominous name, Semundr was remembered as a wise and good man. The Black School, however, appears repeatedly in Icelandic magical lore, a place where those devoted to sorcery went to master their craft. The Age of Peace began to fracture around 1118. Foreign nations wrestled for influence over Iceland, and political corruption took root. Domestic feuds and blood vengeance re-emerged. But in the midst of this unrest, Icelandic culture entered a golden age. This was the time when the great national sagas were written. The poet Snorri Sturluson composed the prose Edda, while the poetic Edda was finally set down in writing. It was an age where past and present balanced each other. Pagan traditions and Catholic faith coexisted in what could be called Iceland's own brand of Christianity. But this balance was not to last. In the early 1500s, the Protestant Reformation swept across Europe. Denmark embraced it in 1536, and as Iceland was under Danish rule, it too was expected to convert. The transition was anything but smooth. Iceland's isolation and cultural conservatism delayed the Reformation, sparking years of conflict. Between 1536 and 1550, the island fought what was effectively a low-intensity religious war. The Protestants ultimately prevailed. In 1550, they executed Iceland's Catholic bishop, John Arason, an act that marked the end of Icelandic Catholicism. The years that followed brought hardship. Denmark restricted Iceland's trade in 1602, forcing all commerce through Danish merchants. Poverty deepened. Danish traders and clergy, acting as agents of the crown, exploited Iceland ruthlessly. A quarter of all church tithes went straight to the Danish king. Heresy and other moral crimes became punishable by death, with the estates of the condemned confiscated for the crown. Sensing their culture was at risk, both Danish and Icelandic antiquarians began preserving Iceland's literary heritage. Among the manuscripts saved from this era were spellbooks and magical texts, precious remnants of the island's magical tradition. And so, despite suppression, we know much about Icelandic magic precisely because of this turbulent time. Later in this video, when we look closely at the methods and techniques of Icelandic witchcraft, much of what we'll explore will come from this era. Two Icelandic magicians in particular act as bridges into the Protestant age. The first was Gottskálk Nicolason, known as the Cruel. He had a reputation for practicing black magic and for being a ruthless political schemer. The second was Halfdan Arason, remembered as something of a white magician. The opposite to Gottskálk's dark reputation, Gottskálk's spellbook, called the Ráðskinna, or the Red Skin, was said to be written in golden letters on red parchment. It was believed to contain the darkest sorcery known to man, much of it rooted in ancient pagan times. After Gottskálk's death, a magician named Galdra Loftur became obsessed with raising his spirit from the dead in order to seize the Ráðskinna for himself. His story is remembered as a cautionary tale of unending hunger for knowledge and power. Another infamous text of the time was the Graskinna, or the Grey Skin. This manuscript supposedly consisted of two parts, the first written in the Roman alphabet, the second encoded in runes to conceal its meaning. According to legend, those who read only the first part could still save their souls, but those who dared to read the second were doomed to eternal damnation. Unsurprisingly, no copies of these books have survived. In an age of Protestant crackdowns, such texts would have been burned the moment they were discovered. The suppression of magic became official on October 12, 1617, when King Christian IV of Denmark outlawed sorcery across all his lands, including Denmark, Norway, Iceland, the Faroe Islands, and Greenland. Casual practitioners could be punished with fines or exile, but true sorcerers were to be executed elsewhere in the kingdom. Witch trials began almost immediately. But in Iceland, the law was not published locally until 13 years later, and when it finally was, it caused confusion. The European belief that witchcraft was inherently evil had never truly taken hold in Iceland. Officials weren't even sure how to conduct trials, imprison magicians, or why executions were necessary in the first place. The result was chaos. Many suspected witches were executed without proper trials, with their supposed crimes recorded only after their deaths. Between 1625 and 1683, around 170 Icelanders were accused of witchcraft. Of those, 21 were executed. Unlike the rest of Europe, where the victims were overwhelmingly women, almost all those executed in Iceland were men. This contrast reflected Iceland's gender roles at the time. Magic was considered a form of knowledge, and knowledge was seen as a masculine domain. Women were thought to have little understanding of sorcery. Still, a handful of women were tried for witchcraft, usually for practicing forms of magic considered distinctly feminine, though these were often dismissed by male sorcerers as lesser or inferior class also played a major role. Nearly all the accused were poor men of the lower classes. If someone of higher status was accused, they were usually acquitted. Most records of Icelandic witch trials have been lost, if they were ever written at all. Court documentation was far less robust than it is today, and what we know often comes from eyewitnesses who casually noted what they saw. But one case survives in detail, the most infamous of Iceland's witch trials, the Kirkjubel affair. Spanning from 1655 to 1660, this single case reveals not only the procedures of witch trials, but also the cultural weight of an accusation, especially when made by the right person. At the center was a reverend named John Magnusson. His life before this trial was unremarkable. Born in 1610 in northwest Iceland, he was the son of a priest, and his brother was also a priest. Naturally, John followed the same path. By 1643, he had become head of his own parish. About a decade later, in 1655, he married and had a child. But that same year, his suffering began. Also living in this town was John Johnson and his son, also named John. The younger John had once asked Reverend John for his daughter's hand in marriage. The Reverend refused, and from that refusal grew a bitter rift between the two families. One afternoon, while walking his usual route through town, the Reverend passed by the Johnsons' farm. He later claimed he had received a strange inner prompting, almost like a whisper in his mind, urging him to visit them. So he did. He stopped in, spoke with them, shared dinner, and even stayed the night. That night, the Reverend woke to the sensation of tiny feet scurrying across his own. He swore it felt like mice crawling under the covers. But when he looked, there was nothing there. The next day, Elder John Johnson, in a drunken haze, confessed to the Reverend that he had sent a spirit to torment him in his sleep. He admitted to dabbling in witchcraft, but claimed the prank had satisfied him and promised he would never repeat it. Believing him, the Reverend went on his way. Days later, during a church gathering, the Johnsons' servant girl complained to Elder John about his son. The younger John overheard and, in a fit of rage, struck her in the face. Reverend John witnessed it all and forced the younger John to apologize. That very night, the Reverend once again felt an unseen creature creeping across his feet. This time, it felt like a cat. And again, when he looked, nothing was there. He claimed his mind then filled with a sudden flood of dark, evil thoughts. Panicked, he fell to his knees in prayer. While praying, he felt the weight of a beast leap onto him, claws raking through his clothes and tearing into his flesh. The pain, he said, was searing, so real, so unbearable, that he feared he was in mortal danger. Yet once more, no beast could be found. These attacks continued night after night. Even his family began experiencing similar strange torments. Convinced it was sorcery, the Reverend crossed the fjord to report the matter to the town sheriff. He shared his story with the sheriff and other local officials. The very next day, as he preached in church, Reverend John collapsed to the floor, writhing before his congregation in a spectacle of agony. During the chaos, the Johnsons tried to flee, but were caught and taken into custody. The sheriff sent a man named Gisli to search their farm. On the way there, Gisli claimed he felt stabbing pains in his feet. At the Johnsons' farm, he discovered a calfskin book filled with strange magical symbols and spells. With this evidence, the Johnsons were put on trial. The Reverend testified that they had invoked Satan against him. Other churchgoers also gave testimony. The Johnsons eventually promised to give up witchcraft, and for a time, the matter seemed settled. But that very night, the Reverend was struck again by invisible torment. The assaults continued into the next year. In 1656, the Johnsons were once again summoned to court. The Reverend described a new attack, an unbearable pain, like the sound of a whale's blowhole blasting directly into his ears, leaving him with a burning headache so intense he could not sleep. The following day, the Johnsons were arrested again. This time, the younger John confessed to harboring hatred for the Reverend ever since he was denied marriage to his daughter. He admitted he had been practicing sorcery more and more, and that he had used magic against both the Reverend and others in town. During the trial, both father and son made no effort to hide their animosity. Officials claimed they even confessed in private before being forced to repeat their words in public. Elder John admitted to much of the Reverend's suffering. He said he had borrowed 2 spell books and sought help from a local sorcerer. He confessed to using magic to kill livestock and claimed he possessed multiple books of runes and charms which he had turned against the Reverend. The younger John also confessed to witchcraft, claiming he had harmed animals, used enchantments to make a girl fall in love with him, and even poured his own blood over runes. Like his father, he admitted to attacking the Reverend with magic. In this time, the punishment for sorcery that caused harm was death by fire, and so, by their own confessions, the Johnsons had sealed their fate. They were sentenced to be burned alive at the stake. On April 10th, 1656, father and son were executed by fire. As the father and son were led to the stake, Reverend John gave them one final chance to repent and seek God's forgiveness. The elder John broke down, begging for mercy and salvation. The younger John, however, refused entirely. His last words were chillingly simple. "May God grant us a good night." They were bound to the stakes before a watching crowd. Strangely, it took 3 separate attempts before the flames would properly catch. Many, including the Reverend, saw this delay as a sinister omen of evil. But at last, the fire consumed them both, and the Johnsons were burned alive before the townspeople. Even then, the Reverend was not satisfied. He demanded compensation, not only for his pain and suffering, but also for court expenses and the work he claimed he had lost. He accused the younger John of failing to pay his church tithe for an entire year, and argued that his property should therefore be forfeited to the church, more specifically to him. The court agreed, granting him much of the younger John's estate, but Reverend John pressed further. He claimed that since Elder John had admitted to being responsible for most of the witchcraft, he too owed restitution. Town officials ordered much of the Kirkjubel farm sold off. Giving the proceeds to the Reverend still, his sufferings did not end. The mysterious fits and attacks returned. At first, he believed the younger John was haunting him from beyond the grave, but the torments only grew worse. He began experiencing violent seizures. There was also another member of the Johnson family, Dorry Thor, the sister, who lived at the Kirkjubel farm on and off. She understandably held deep resentment toward the Reverend for the execution of her father and brother. The Reverend became convinced that whenever Dorry was nearby, his pain worsened. He accused her of witchcraft as well, claiming she sought revenge. Fearing these accusations might become a real trial, Dorry left the town. Even so, the Reverend attempted to bring charges against her 3 times in different courts. Each case was dismissed outright. But he would not stop. He publicly called her a demon, and in one heated argument, even spat in her face. At that point, Dory fought back. She essentially countersued the Reverend, accusing him of years of false accusations, slander, and the wrongful execution of her family. She pointed out that much of her family's estate had been stripped away and handed to him over baseless charges. At trial, she asked, if he had never shown mercy to her family, why should the court show mercy to him? The outcome of this trial is murky. Records don't say exactly what became of it, but most believe Dory won. There was never any evidence she had practiced witchcraft, and she was well liked by the townspeople, while the Reverend was increasingly despised. She also had powerful allies on her side. Whatever the verdict, she lived on. Her name appears in the 1703 census, showing she reached at least 65 years of age. The Reverend, on the other hand, declined into poverty and disgrace. He eventually moved into the Kirkjubel farmhouse itself, where he lived until his death at age 86. Scholars today speculate on what illness or condition might have caused his torments and seizures, but most agree that Reverend John was never of sound mind. Still, his writings and the court records of the Kirkjubel affair remain one of the most detailed accounts of how Icelandic witch trials were carried out. Now that we've seen the context of this dark era, we can turn to the craft itself, the technical side of Icelandic magic. Several books survive that preserve fragments of spells, lore, and runes. One was compiled by John the Learned, containing charms and rune work. An Icelandic physician's manual from the 1400s mixes medicine with magic, invoking Odin, Thor, and Freya. Dozens of texts like these exist, though many are incomplete or scattered, but one book stands apart, a spell book that survived intact when so many others were lost. The most famous of all Icelandic magical texts, the Galdrabok, written in the late 1500s. The Galdrabok is a collection of 47 spells, an index of Icelandic sorcery. It was likely compiled by a mix of Icelandic magicians and Danish scribes during the Protestant era. In 1682, it was acquired by a Danish antiquarian and later sent to Stockholm, where it became part of the National Academy of Sciences, and there it remains to this day. The Galdrabok doesn't waste time with commentary or moral judgment. It simply lays out the spells and incantations, a window into the theology and practice of early Icelandic sorcerers. The spells themselves cover a wide spectrum of purposes. Protection dominates the collection. 18 spells promise to shield the user from harm, whether that danger comes from man or magic. 9 spells promise good fortune, 6 guard against thieves, a concern that clearly weighed heavily on the authors, and 1 spell even grants invisibility. At first glance, these seem mostly harmless, even positive, but the Galdrabok also contains a darker edge. Some spells cause mischief, like making a victim fart uncontrollably. Others are much crueler, killing livestock or forcing a woman to fall in love. What surprises many readers is how much Christianity is woven into the text. 9 spells directly cite Christian prayers or figures. 8 show roots in Judeo-Gnostic traditions, while 5 openly blend Christian references with older Germanic paganism. When read alongside other Icelandic sources, the Galdrabok reveals a strange theological tapestry. Odin, Thor, Freya, and Baldur appear regularly, as do trolls, elves, and even giants. Valhalla itself is invoked. Yet alongside them, Christian demons are called upon too. In one spell, the invocation reads, "Help me in this, all you gods, Thor, Odin, Frigg, Freya, Satan, Beelzebub, and all who dwell in Valhalla. The idea of Satan sitting in Valhalla is striking. It shows just how much Christianity had fused with the old pagan faith. Over time, Christians sought to literally demonize the Norse gods, casting them into the same category as Satan. But Iceland never fully bought into this framework. For Icelanders, the old gods were never wholly evil, and Christian figures were never accepted as wholly good. Instead, a strange trinity took root: pagan gods, Christian saints, and Christian demons, all mingling together in one magical worldview. That brings us to the big question: how did Icelandic sorcerers believe magic actually worked? Through what forces did they think their spells gained power? The short answer is, they probably didn't overthink it. If a spell worked, it worked. But reading between the lines, a pattern emerges: willpower. At its core, Icelandic magic seems to have been powered by an almost weaponized form of concentrated will. Spell instructions often demanded strong faith, fierce focus, or even anger. Some told the practitioner to skip evening prayers so their thoughts wouldn't be closed off for the night. Others required fasting or physical hardship. The discomfort meant to sharpen emotion into raw energy. This willpower was then channeled into runes, chants, or even human blood, tools that acted like conductors, turning desire into actual sorcery. The history of Icelandic witchcraft is fascinating on its own, but equally remarkable is how much of the old worldview still lingers in Iceland today. Of course, Iceland is not a pagan nation anymore. Christianity dominates, and the country ranks among the most secular in the world. Yet ancient traditions have survived here in ways rarely seen elsewhere. Take Asatru, the modern revival of Norse paganism. Founded in 1972, it's now the largest non-Christian religion in Iceland, with thousands of members. While it isn't directly tied to witchcraft, it serves as a living bridge, connecting modern Icelanders to the myths, gods, and magic of their ancestors. Before moving forward, there's an elephant in the room about Asatru that needs to be addressed. Asatru in Iceland is a non-political movement. It isn't right-wing in any way, shape, or form. However, outside of Iceland, certain groups in America and Europe have stolen the name Asatru to build hateful organizations. These groups have absolutely no connection to or foundation in the Icelandic Church. In fact, the church itself has openly condemned using Asatru to push any kind of supremacist or race-based ideology. On the contrary, scholars describe Icelandic Asatru as open-minded. The church has even leaned into vaguely left-leaning causes, like environmentalism. But it is not, at its core, a political organization. Back in the early 1970s, some Icelanders grew frustrated with being forced to pay taxes to the Christian church. Instead, they wanted a religion that felt closer to Iceland's traditional culture and natural landscape. This group of like-minded people came together, and in 1972, Asatru was officially established. By the following year, it gained formal recognition from the Icelandic government. At their first meeting in 1973, there were only 21 members. But the movement grew quickly, and today, over 5,700 Icelanders practice Asatru. Of course, modern Asatru cannot fully recreate the old ways. Ancient Nordic practices varied depending on time, place, and community. And moral values have shifted. Human sacrifice is obviously unacceptable, and even animal sacrifice has been abandoned. In the old sagas, it was common to sprinkle blood over groups of people during ceremonies. But today, that would be not only messy, but downright dangerous. Instead, modern Asatru pieces together elements from pre-Christian Iceland into something that fits today's world. It is a religion with temples, high priests, and ceremonies, but it exists more in diversity than dogma. There isn't a strict pantheon of gods to worship or a fixed narrative of creation and salvation. Rather, the sacred is found in values, traditions, and myths from Iceland's most ancient texts. Also sacred are the cultural heritage and deep respect for nature, which has long been imagined or experienced as supernatural. Together, these elements form the Asatru idea of Forn Sidur, or our custom. It's a foundation of pride and inspiration for the faith that said, Asatru still represents only a small fraction of Iceland's population, and its importance to modern Iceland should not be overstated. It would be misleading to suggest the country is once again an island of pagans. Individual Icelanders have very different relationships with their history. Some feel deeply connected to pre-Christian traditions, while others couldn't care less, or would rather leave those traditions behind entirely. What is true, though, is that Iceland's pagan history has survived into modern times in ways rarely seen in other developed nations. Through Asatru, Iceland maintains a living link to its past and culture. But to really understand how this history shaped ideas of paganism and witchcraft in Iceland, we need to look at another essential factor: the land itself. Iceland is dramatic, harsh, and unforgiving. The island is battered by the icy waters and storms of the North Atlantic. It is a place of extremes, home to both volcanoes and glaciers, quite literally a land of fire and ice. Winters are long, summers are fleeting, and spring and autumn barely exist. Arable farmland is scarce, and livestock often struggles to graze. Add to that earthquakes and volcanic eruptions, and you have a land where the earth itself regularly shakes, rumbles, and threatens destruction. All these natural forces compete to bring hardship upon Iceland's people. Simply put, Iceland squeezes the most out of its inhabitants. Before modern technology, the idea of magic wasn't just mystical. It was practical, even necessary. Magic offered hope in the face of brutal survival. And when we look at Icelandic texts, the spells they contain don't chase after grand metaphysical truths or cosmic secrets. They are about survival. Rather than chasing grand mysteries, Icelandic magic focused on solving the everyday struggles of life. There were charms for avoiding thieves, spells for catching more fish, rituals for keeping yourself safe from danger. To people of the old world, these weren't abstract ideas. They were practical tools, incredibly useful for survival. Because of this, Icelandic magic feels strikingly accessible. Yes, there were a few ambitious individuals who devoted their entire lives to sorcery, but for the most part, anyone could practice it. Spells rarely required years of training, and the items they called for were usually ordinary things people already had on hand. Iceland also stands apart as the only country where witch-burning records consistently show victims in possession of magic books, and these victims were almost always from the lower classes. That fact alone tells us something powerful. Magical knowledge in Iceland wasn't reserved for a priestly elite. It was widely spread among ordinary people. But Iceland's relationship with knowledge has always gone beyond magic. The island was first settled by cultural conservatives from Norway, people deeply concerned with preserving their heritage, which became the foundation of Icelandic identity. When Christianity arrived, it brought new opportunities to learn. Churches, schools, and study abroad programs opened doors for scholarship. The old love of preservation, paired with new access to education, produced something remarkable. A society with a strong national intellectual tradition. Even today, Iceland is a nation of readers and thinkers. It consistently ranks among the highest in literacy and education, and per capita, it publishes more books than anywhere else in the world. While many other factors play into this, the country's obsession with knowledge can be traced all the way back to its beginnings. Through every challenge, Icelanders have shown extraordinary resilience. Harsh landscapes, political pressures, even cultural shifts. All of these could have broken them. Instead, they seem to have only strengthened the values and traditions at the core of the culture. As a result, Iceland is one of the rare places where magic has not just survived in whispers, but has been actively recorded, explored, and preserved. This is why we know so much about Icelandic magic today. But even with all this knowledge, there's one thing we need to keep in mind if we want to truly understand it. Or honestly, to understand any history. Perspective. It's tempting, from our modern world of science and rationality, to wave away talk of spells and witchcraft as silly superstition. We can look at magic casually, as if it's quaint or ridiculous. But for people in early Iceland, it wasn't a matter of belief. Magic wasn't something you chose to believe in. It was simply real. As real to them as the color red, the color blue, the sun, or the moon. Keeping that perspective allows us to see their world as they saw it. With empathy, we gain not just an understanding of their traditions, but a window into how they lived and what they valued. It's only through this lens that we can achieve an authentic view of the world as it once was. Niccolo Machiavelli is remembered as one of history's original villains, and for reasons that feel justified. He turned away from the morals of his time, rejected Christian ideals, and cut goodness open at its root. In its place, he built a cold, deliberate system of power, ruthlessness, and deception. Machiavelli's work is a tangle of contradictions, harsh truths, dark advocacy, and fierce determination. Yet if you look beyond the caricature of his name, you'll find sober lessons about how the world really works and how to move within it. To grasp his thought, you have to know his life and the storm he was born into. He came into the world in 1469 in Florence. His family was old and respected, but his father Bernardo was its poorest member, a once practicing lawyer with few assets but many connections. Bernardo doubted religion as far as one safely could at the time. Machiavelli's mother was the opposite, a devout poet of hymns. This mix of skepticism and literary skill would shape her son's mind. Florence called itself a republic. On paper, 8 priors and a rotating head official ruled. Every 2 months, new names of prominent men were drawn by lot to stop any one group from seizing control. In practice, it was chaos. Policies flipped constantly. The Medici family manipulated the drawing to ensure their allies' names filled the urn. Florence was, in reality, a disguised dictatorship. This was hardly unusual in Italy. Wars erupted over scraps of territory. Mercenary captains betrayed their patrons overnight. Power and pretense were worlds apart. Machiavelli grew up watching this hypocrisy firsthand and learned what happened to losers in politics. When he was 9, men who plotted against the Medici were hanged upside down from a public building and left to rot for weeks. Corruption and brutality were not abstractions to him. Little is known of his youth, but he was well educated. When the Medici were overthrown in 1494, he entered government, drafting state papers. Soon, he rose higher. At 28, he became second Chancellor of Florence, one of its two main departments, and Secretary of the Ten of War, which handled foreign policy and military affairs. No one knows how he rose so fast. Some call him a failed politician. That's not quite fair. For over a decade, he was Florence's top diplomat. His city was weak, his times unstable, and still he held high office. But in 1512, the Medici returned. They suspected him of conspiracy, imprisoned and tortured him, then sent him into exile. There, stripped of power, he wrote his most famous work. The Prince is not his only book, but it is the one that endures. It was written as a guide for rulers, specifically for Lorenzo de' Medici. At the time, greatness in a leader was measured by goodness, at least in theory. Machiavelli threw that aside. A ruler's duty, he said, was not to be good, but to keep and strengthen power. Ethics and politics, once linked, were split apart. The Prince is not a manual for living well. It is a manual for ruling effectively. Machiavelli didn't deny morality. He simply said it cannot always guide a leader who wants to survive. This was bold, even cruel, but it was honest. He could have softened his message, written as if power were distasteful. Instead, he wrote plainly, tearing apart comforting ideals and laying down a grim but often accurate picture of the world. He admired Cesare Borgia, son of Pope Alexander VI. With his father's backing, Borgia carved out a state in Italy. In 1502, he seized the city of Cesena, then left his lieutenant, Ramiro de Lorqua, to impose order. Borgia gave him full freedom to be as harsh as needed. De Lorqua obeyed. He beheaded men in front of their families, seized property, castrated dissenters. When the city was subdued, Borgia returned. By then, the people hated De Lorqua, and by extension, Borgia. So Borgia staged a masterstroke. One night, he had De Lorqua cut in two, his head stuck on a pike, and the pieces displayed in the town square. In the morning, the people rejoiced at their tormentor's death. Borgia addressed them, claiming De Lorqua had acted alone, a savage monster he himself had put down for the public's sake. It was ruthless, theatrical, and effective. A betrayal of a loyal servant, yet a perfect act of power. Throughout The Prince, Machiavelli praises Cesare Borgia as the model ruler. Machiavelli believed that goodness was admirable. It was even desirable. But, he said, you cannot be an effective leader and be good at all times. Politics, to him, was an endless knife fight. It demanded ruthlessness. A ruler cannot always be compassionate, loyal, humane, and honest, because the role itself will sometimes require cruelty, disloyalty, deception, and harshness. This is the frame for one of his most famous questions. Is it better to be loved or feared? His answer is revealing. It's best to be both, he says, but that's rare. And in general, it's safer to be feared than loved. People are fickle. Some are cowards. Some lie. Some can be bought. Some simply change their minds. They may swear love to you today and betray you tomorrow. But fear, Machiavelli argues, endures. Fear is a real, tangible restraint. It keeps people in line when their affection fades. Love can be forgotten. Fear cannot. You cannot command how people love you, but you can command what they fear. Still, there's a limit. Fear is useful, but hatred is dangerous. Hatred breeds assassinations and conspiracies. So, if you must be violent or cruel, do it swiftly and discreetly. Never let it harden into public hatred. Be loved when you can. Be feared when you must. But never, ever be hated. For Machiavelli, that was the mark of a successful leader. He also stripped honesty from the list of sacred virtues. Honesty, he said, is admirable, but not always effective. A cunning leader will outmaneuver an honest one. Circumstances change, and so must your promises. It may be ugly, but this is what it takes to hold power and build a state. If people will lie to you, he asks, what duty do you have to be truthful to them? Why hand your enemies a weapon you know they will use? Yet, even while rejecting personal virtue, Machiavelli insisted on its appearance. A ruler does not need to be virtuous. He must look virtuous. To win the people's devotion, he says, you need two things: appearances and results. Most citizens see only your words and your stage-managed image. Few glimpse what happens behind closed doors. They judge by what they see, not by what is. So speak and act as if guided by virtue. But they will also judge your success by your results. And you cannot always achieve results through honesty, kindness, or any other virtue. That is not how the game is played. Thus, we arrive at the house Machiavelli built, or at least the version the world remembers. Not necessarily cruel, but willing to be cruel. Not innately dishonest, but willing to deceive, to lie, to harm. This is a worldview scarred by cynicism, or as he might say, by realism. Over and over, he calls people unreliable, dishonest, selfish. And so, he says, you must be prepared to act the same way. But even this summary is incomplete. His writings hold not only darkness, but also unsettling truths. Machiavelli famously rejected Christianity as a practical guide for life. In The Prince, he writes, almost mockingly, I know many believe that the world is ruled by God and by fortune, and that no matter how shrewd men are, they can do nothing to protect themselves. He scoffs at the idea of God controlling our fates, and in that there is a kind of inspiration. You, not God, hold agency over your life. Now act. As always, Machiavelli treats life itself as a struggle, a contest between virtù and fortuna. Throughout The Prince, he uses the word virtù. It sounds like virtue, but that's a misleading translation. Machiavelli was not obsessed with a simple struggle between good and evil. What fascinated him was success versus failure, strength versus weakness. There is no neat English word for virtù. Prowess comes close, as does force of character. But virtù is broader. It is any quality that lets you reach your goals. Talent, boldness, courage, willpower, cunning, intelligence. It is the inner power that creates agency. With virtù, a person can become truly great. Set against this is fortuna, fortune. Here Machiavelli is more straightforward. Fortuna is the part of life we cannot control. He writes that fortune determines about half of what happens to us. The other half belongs to us and to our virtù. He uses a striking image. Imagine a river that regularly floods a valley, destroying villages and killing people. That is fortuna. But we are not helpless. We can build banks and dams, channeling the water so that its floods do not harm us. This is virtù meeting fortuna. Preparation, planning, mastery. Fortune, he says, only holds power where you allow it to. With foresight and virtù, you can at least be ready when fortune strikes. The reverse is also true. You can succeed one day by doing X, Y, and Z, then fail the next, doing exactly the same things. Fortune changes, and so must you. Adapt or die. Machiavelli also believed there was a beast inside every human being. Beneath our morals, beneath our civilized habits, lives an animal driven to fulfill its desires. In this, he was ahead of his time. Carl Jung would later call it the shadow, Freud the subconscious. Like them, Machiavelli urged neither suppression nor surrender. We must learn to work with the beast, be ethical, kind, and just whenever possible. But in pursuit of a goal, be willing to draw on the animal. Be the lion who scares off the hyenas. Be the fox too clever to be trapped. Playing only by the rules and morals of man will take you only so far. Machiavelli offers another piercing insight, the difference between the world as it should be and the world as it is. He warns that the gap between these two things is enormous. If you live by how the world ought to be, rather than how it actually works, you author your own destruction. The world is no utopia. There is goodness in it, but it is not wholly good. There are traps, lies, and threats. You must be wary of them and act with resilience. Live according to reality, not to your hopes about reality. This, more than any easy label of villainy, strikes at the heart of Machiavelli's philosophy. And yet, when we try to put his principles into practice, we hit problems. The Prince was written as a gift to Lorenzo de' Medici, an attempt to win back favour and employment after the Medici had imprisoned, tortured, and exiled him. Machiavelli never got the job. Lorenzo probably never even read the book. Even if he had, the irony is sharp. Why would anyone invite into their inner circle the man who openly celebrates deceit, backstabbing, and opportunism? Machiavelli's ideas, when public, become antisocial. They are powerful to read, but dangerous to be associated with. He sacrificed himself for his ideology. Who would read The Prince and want to stand next to Niccolo Machiavelli? The answer, it seems, was no one. Though not a total failure, Machiavelli never rose to great power. He drafted no constitutions, led no revolutions, governed no cities or countries. For all his theorizing, he left no clear record of having applied his own ideas with dramatic success. Perhaps, as he advised, he hid his moves. But history leaves little evidence of a truly Machiavellian Machiavelli. After the Prince failed to win him office, he drifted back into womanizing and wrote bawdy comedies that made him famous but did not return him to politics. At one point, a Medici cousin asked for his advice on a looming war between France and Spain. He was tasked with strengthening Florence's defences, but when the time came, the Spanish bypassed Florence entirely and sacked Rome instead. The Medici fell again, and Machiavelli was out of work once more. He became ill and died within a month. His political career was small, but his legacy is vast. When The Prince finally appeared in print, an English cardinal said it had been written by Satan's finger. Pope Paul IV banned it at once. In France, during the violent struggles between Protestant Huguenots and Catholics, the young king, Charles IX, reigned in name, while his mother, Catherine de' Medici, a Florentine and daughter of the very Lorenzo to whom the prince was dedicated, ruled in fact. During the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of 1572, thousands of Huguenots were slaughtered. Catherine was blamed. A survivor, Innocent Gentile, published a book depicting Catherine as a compulsive reader of Machiavelli and branding Machiavelli as the archetype of a cruel Italian villain. His work wrenched Machiavelli's ideas out of context and convinced readers that Machiavelli advocated unrestrained brutality and the rejection of virtue altogether. This distorted version spread quickly. It was translated into Latin and English before The Prince itself was available in English. Machiavelli's name moved from elite discourse into popular culture, inspiring the stock figure of the scheming villain in plays and literature. His name became a synonym for evil. In reality, Machiavelli's thesis was narrower, that Christian morals and effective leadership were not always compatible. Most people today would probably agree. While public opinion never fully softened, his philosophy has been embraced by leaders around the world. They are not all moral, nor all amoral, not all authoritarian, nor all permissive. But whether he predicted modern politics or helped shape it, his writings describe today's power games with uncanny accuracy. Modern politicians must maintain a facade of morality, and one hopes act on it when possible. But in practice, there remains a gap between ethics and ambition. Few would deny this. For me, the most interesting part of Machiavelli is not the early debates about his politics, but the deeper reflections on life, power, and human nature. They hold a wisdom that is timeless, even if we wish it were not. I resist much of Machiavelli's cynicism. I would never want to be like Cesare Borgia, nor have a leader like him. I believe people are basically good. Machiavelli would laugh at me. He would say, I am living by how I think the world should be, not how it is. There is a single-minded force in his writing. He does not care about goodness, about God, or about friends. His philosophy cares about one thing: power. And there is something almost admirable in that determination, even if it is not relevant to every life. Like all great villains, Machiavelli is dangerous. It is dangerous to swallow his ideas whole, and perhaps just as dangerous to ignore them completely.